All right, welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at, well, it's been all over the news, right? The euro's just been surging
Yeah,
against the US
it's
dollar.
really crazy.
And it had like its biggest weekly jump in 17 years.
Yeah, no kidding.
It went from, below 1.04 and now it's almost at 1.09. It's pretty remarkable.
That,
So, and we've got some analysts here from, let's see, Credit Agricole, UBS, Berenberg Bank, and SESE.
great sources.
Yeah, so we're going to be looking at, well, first of all, why is this happening?
Right.
What does it mean? And where could things go from here?
Yeah, I think that's the million-dollar question everyone wants to know. Is this a temporary blip, or is this, the start of a longer-term trend?
Right, exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So before we even get to, like, all the predictions and everything, let's just make sure we understand, like, the mechanics of what's happening. So we keep hearing this term overbought.
Right.
Can you break that down for us? What does that even mean?
Sure. So you can kind of think about it like, like a stock that's gone up really fast in a short amount of time.
Okay.
And it might be due for a bit of a breather, a slight dip, before it potentially continues to climb higher.
Okay.
That's what analysts typically mean when they're talking about something being overbought.
Okay.
And one of the tools they use for this is something called the Relative Strength Index, or RSI. And that basically just gives them a sense of whether a currency has risen too quickly.
Okay.
So when the RSI goes above 70, it's a bit of a signal that a correction could be coming.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not like necessarily a bad thing. It's just sort of like a sign that things could maybe slow down a bit before they continue to go higher.
Yeah, precisely. Now, what's interesting about this particular euro surge is that it's not just about, those kind of technical indicators.
Right.
There are some fundamental things going on, especially in Europe.
Right. Germany's doing some massive spending right now.
Yeah, hard to ignore. 500 billion euros.
Yeah, 500 billion. It's a lot.
In infrastructure and defense. It's a huge investment.
Yeah, but so how does that translate into a stronger euro, though?
Right.
Because that seems like more of a domestic policy,
Yeah.
not like a global thing.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah.
So basically, this kind of spending, it's expected to boost economic growth within Germany and probably, across the Eurozone as a whole.
Right.
And generally, when an economy grows, its currency tends to strengthen as well.
So like more economic activity, more demand for euros.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
And then on top of that, I mean, you've got some places like Berenberg Bank. They're actually predicting that this spending could push German economic growth up to 1.4% in both 2026 and 2027.
Wow.
Which is pretty significant. And that kind of growth, it could lead to higher interest rates.
Oh, okay. So higher interest rates set by the European Central Bank.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so what impact does that have? Well, higher interest rates actually make a currency more attractive to global investors because they can earn a better return.
Okay.
So the possibility of those rising rates, it's definitely contributing to the euro's appeal right now.
So it's kind of like Germany's throwing this huge party and suddenly everyone wants to come. And so like the price of admission,
Right.
which is the euro, goes up.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
Okay.
But, it's not just about Europe's good fortune.
Right.
The U.S. dollar is playing a role in this, too.
Yeah.
You remember we were talking about those U.S. tariffs a while back?
Yeah, the ones on Canada, Mexico, and China.
Right.
Didn't those actually cause the dollar to strengthen at first?
Yeah, they did. And that's because tariffs can lead to inflation, and a strong currency is often seen as a hedge against inflation.
Okay.
But now the market's starting to get a little worried about, the longer-term impact of those tariffs on U.S. economic growth.
So it's like a sugar rush that wears off and then you just get a headache.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a growing concern that these tariffs could actually end up hurting U.S. businesses and could actually slow down the economy. And here's a sign of that shifting sentiment. The market is actually now predicting multiple Fed rate cuts in 2025.
Wow. Okay, so that's a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
So it sounds like the market's kind of losing confidence in the dollar, at least for the longer term. But could this really be like a turning point? I mean, could the euro actually surpass the dollar in the global financial landscape?
I mean, that is the big question, isn't it? And honestly, I think it's still too early to tell for sure.
Right.
But there are definitely analysts out there, like those at SEB, who are starting to get a little more optimistic about the euro's future.
Okay.
They're actually pointing back to 2017 as a year when the euro performed really well as a potential parallel.
2017, huh? So they're saying we might see a repeat.
Well, they're saying it's possible.
Yeah.
They're pointing to a couple things.
Sure.
First, Europe's economic outlook seems to be improving.
Right.
Inflation's getting closer to its target, and the projections for growth are at least modest.
Okay.
But uh, second, and this is really key, they believe that European fiscal policies, like Germany's spending plan, could actually make a real difference in boosting growth.
Okay.
And they're even going so far as to say that they think Europe might outperform the U.S. in the coming years.
Wow. So it's not just about the U.S. faltering. It's about
Right.
Europe actually stepping up their game.
Exactly.
Okay. So, I mean, before we all get like too excited and start popping champagne for the euro's comeback,
Right.
we should probably talk about the downsides.
Right.
What are like the things that could derail this euro rally?
So those U.S. tariffs on European goods, those are a big concern
Okay.
if those are implemented. And if they really do hit European exports hard,
Right.
it could definitely put a brake on the euro's upward momentum.
Yeah, that makes sense. Trade war is rarely good for anybody.
Right, exactly.
So, okay, what about this? We talked about the short covering thing earlier. Could that like reverse and send the euro tumbling?
Potentially, yeah. Just to recap, short covering is basically when investors who bet against the euro, they rush to buy it back to
Right.
cover their losses.
Right.
And that buying frenzy, it can push the price up. But if sentiment shifts, and if those investors start betting against the euro again,
Right.
it could have the opposite effect.
So it's like the wind changes direction
Right.
and suddenly it's
Yeah.
pushing the euro in a different way.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So any other potential risks we should be thinking about?
Well, I mean, there's always those geopolitical risks.
Right.
Sudden escalation of tensions in Ukraine,
Mm.
a major political upheaval in one of the key European countries.
Right.
Anything like that could really spook investors and send them running back to the safety of the U.S. dollar.
Yeah, like those black swan events, the things you can never predict, but they could have a huge impact.
Exactly.
So, okay, I mean, the euro surge is definitely exciting, but you're right. We gotta stay cautious, keep our eye on everything.
Absolutely.
But before we move on, I do want to go back to this idea of the euro potentially, outperforming the US dollar in the coming years.
Right.
So what would it actually take for that to happen?
Well, a couple of things.
Okay.
I mean, first, Europe would need to show some sustained economic strength, like growth exceeding expectations, inflation staying under control.
Okay, so Europe's going to prove they're not just a one-hit wonder.
Right, exactly.
Mm.
And then second, the U.S. dollar would need to weaken further.
Okay.
And that could happen because of things happening within the U.S., like slower growth, or maybe the Fed making more aggressive interest rate cuts, or it could even be external factors like a loss of confidence in U.S. leadership or the global role of the dollar.
Right.
So, it's not just about Europe rising, it's also about the U.S. potentially stumbling.
Right. Okay.
And then finally, and this is maybe the most important factor, investors would need to actually change their perception of Europe.
Okay.
They need to see it as a place with a bright future, not just, this region struggling with debt and political uncertainty.
Right. A change in the narrative is important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because investors, they're always looking for that next big story. And if Europe can position itself as the story of growth and opportunity,
Right.
it could attract a lot more investment. And that would, of course, further strengthen the euro.
Okay, so we need like economic fundamentals.
Right.
We need a weaker US dollar. We need a change in investor perception. That's a pretty tall order.
It is a tall order, but it's not impossible. It would require a real concerted effort from European policymakers and, of course, some favorable global conditions.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, it sounds like it's going to be an interesting ride for sure. I mean, we've gone from like a dramatic euro surge to talking about a potential long-term shift in the global financial landscape.
It has been quite the conversation.
It really has. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I do want to leave our listeners with something to kind of ponder, to think about. What specific events or policies beyond what we've talked about today could either speed up or derail the euro's rise in the coming months?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it really reminds us that the financial markets are constantly in flux.
Right.
It's a dynamic system, and we need to stay informed and adaptable.
So much to keep our eyes on.
Yeah.
But that's kind of the beauty of it, right? Like this constant evolution is what makes the financial world so fascinating.
overbought correction territory
Right.
to now talking about the euro challenging the dollar. Like, this is big.
It is big, and we were talking about 2017. I remember you said 2017 was a good year.
Yeah, that was a good year for the euro.
Yeah.
And some people are saying we could see a repeat. So what do you think about that?
I mean, could we really see something like that again?
Well, it's possible. You never know. Right. But there's a couple things that are, pointing in that direction.
Okay.
I mean, first of all, you know, Europe's economic outlook, it does seem to be getting a little bit better, right? Inflation is, it's getting closer to that target. And the projections for growth are, at least modest, which is good.
Right.
But then, and this is really the important part, they believe that European fiscal policies, like the spending plan that Germany's got going on, could actually make a real difference in boosting growth.
Yeah.
And some analysts are even saying that they think Europe might outperform the U.S. in the next couple of years, which is,
So it's not just about the U.S. like falling behind, it's about Europe stepping
right,
up.
exactly.
Okay. But before we all get too carried away and, start celebrating the euro's comeback,
Yeah.
I think we need to talk about some of the risks here.
Yeah, right.
So what are the things that could like really derail this euro rally?
So those U.S. tariffs that we talked about
Mm.
on European goods, those are, I think, still a major concern.
Okay.
If those are implemented and they really do hit European exports hard,
Yeah.
that could really put the brakes on things.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. Trade war is not usually good for anyone.
Exactly.
All right. So what about that short covering thing that we were talking about?
Right.
Could that reverse? Could that send the euro tumbling?
It definitely could, yeah.
Yeah.
And just to quickly recap, short covering is basically when you have investors who bet against the euro,
Right.
and then they suddenly rush to buy it back to cover their losses.
Right. Right.
And that buying frenzy can really push the price up. But if the sentiment shifts again, if those investors start betting against the euro again,
Right.
it could have the opposite effect.
It's like the wind changing direction.
Exactly.
Suddenly.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So anything else? Any other risks that we should be thinking about?
I mean, there's always the kind of the wild card of geopolitical risks, right?
Right.
Like what if tensions in Ukraine suddenly escalate?
Mm-hmm.
Or, what if there's some major political upheaval in one of the, major European countries? I mean, anything like that could really spook investors
Yeah.
and send them running back to the perceived safety of the U.S. dollar.
Right. Right. Those black swan events that you can't predict, but they could have a huge impact.
Exactly. So, yeah, the euro's recent surge is definitely exciting.
Yeah.
But, we do have to stay cautious and keep an eye on all these different factors.
Okay. Lots to think about. So I want to go back to that idea of the euro potentially, outperforming the U.S. dollar in the coming years.
Yeah.
What would it really take for that to happen?
So a few things would need to happen.
Okay.
I mean, first of all, Europe would really need to show some, sustained economic strength,
Okay.
like growth exceeding expectations, inflation staying under control, that kind of thing.
So they've got to prove it's not just a one-time thing.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then second, the U.S. dollar would need to weaken further.
Right.
And that could happen because of things happening in the U.S., like slower growth, or maybe the Fed cuts interest rates more aggressively,
Okay.
or could even be external factors like, if there's a loss of confidence in U.S. leadership or in the role of the dollar globally.
Right.
So it's not just about Europe, rising up. It's also about the U.S. potentially stumbling a little bit.
Right. Right.
And then finally, and this might be the most important thing, investors would really need to change their perception of Europe.
Okay.
They'd need to start seeing it as a place with, a bright future,
Yeah.
not just this region that's struggling with debt and political uncertainty.
Right.
So it's really about a change in the narrative, right?
Yeah.
Investors are always looking for that next big story.
Right.
And if Europe can position itself as that story of growth and opportunity,
Right.
it could attract a lot of investment, which, of course, would further strengthen the euro.
Okay. So economic fundamentals, weaker U.S. dollar, change in investor perception. It's a tall order.
It is a tall order, but it's not, impossible.
Right.
It would require, a real concerted effort from European policymakers and, of course, some, favorable global conditions.
Right. Okay.
Wow.
Well, it sounds like we're in for an interesting ride.
It does, yeah.
I mean, we've gone from a dramatic euro surge to talking about a potential long-term shift in the global financial landscape. It's pretty crazy.
It really is.
Yeah. All right. Well, before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about, something to ponder.
Right.
What specific events or policies, beyond what we've talked about today, could either speed up or derail the euro's rise in the coming months?
It's a great question, and it really reminds us that the financial markets are constantly changing.
Right.
It's a very dynamic system, and we need to stay informed and adaptable.
Yeah, so much to keep our eyes on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
But that's kind of the beauty of it, right? This constant evolution, it's what makes the financial world so fascinating.
I totally agree.
Okay, so we've gone from talking about like overbought conditions to, now the euro could maybe challenge the dollar's dominance.
It's been a wild ride.
It has been a wild ride. I feel like we've given our listeners a front row seat to a really important moment in like financial history.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah, and I think we've, given them the pieces of the puzzle.
Right.
Now it's up to them to see how those pieces might fit together
Exactly.
as this story unfolds.
Yeah, absolutely. Nobody has a crystal ball, but, if you understand the forces at play, you can make more informed decisions
Right, exactly.
and hopefully, come out ahead.
To all our listeners, I say keep your eyes peeled, stay curious.
Couldn't agree more.
That's it for our deep dive into the Euro surge. We hope you've enjoyed the journey with us.
It's been fun.
Yeah, it has. All right, we'll see you next time.
Absolutely. Yeah, it has. And, nobody can really predict the future, but at least we can, arm ourselves with the knowledge to make, smarter decisions.
Right,
As
exactly.
things play out.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the whole point, right? To be informed and make the best decisions we can.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right, so to all our listeners out there, I say, keep your eyes open, stay curious, keep learning.
Yeah. Couldn't agree more.
That's going to do it for this deep dive on the Euro's wild ride.
Yeah.
Hope you all enjoyed the journey.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, it has. All right, we'll catch you all on the next one.